The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great story since 1898. If you find Ottawa history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And enjoy today's segment.
Hello, my name is Jean-Luc Pilon. I'm an archaeologist. I was formerly at the Museum of History, and I'm an adjunct professor at Carleton University. Now, I wanted to share with you today a little bit of my understanding of the ancient history of the Ottawa area. Now, today it's very common practice to hear land acknowledgements when there are public events, to acknowledge the people whose land we're on and the people whose ancestors have lived there forever. And I think these are really important moments and they're very important messages, because it's an opportunity for us to remind ourselves of the link that the Indigenous people have with the land that we're allowed to use. And what I'm hoping to achieve today is to be able to give you some images that whenever a land acknowledgement is heard in the future, you'll be able to see bits and pieces of what I present to you today and make that link with the land a lot stronger, and our understanding of the importance of the land for the Indigenous people a lot stronger as well. Now, archaeology is the study of the past through the material remains that are found still in the ground. And archaeology, of course, comes out of a Western tradition of scientific inquiry, and it has all sorts of warts and problems inherent in it. Oral history, traditional knowledge, is another source of information about the distant past that is kept by Indigenous peoples. They aren't always the same thing, but usually they're very complementary to each other. And they give us a much more rounded picture when we can put the two together. Today, I can only give you what I know. I can only give you what archaeology has told me about the ancient past. There's lots and lots more that can be added to this, and we have to be cognizant of that. Now, in the very early part of this century, two chiefs, Anishinaabe Algonquin chiefs, happened to separately publish books that recount the stories of their peoples and their communities. One was Kirby White Duck in 2002, and he published Algonquin Traditional Culture. And at the same time, a couple years later, Stephen McGregor published Since Time Immemorial, Our Story. So these are really good sources to get complementary information that really allow us to see how the Indigenous communities have changed through time in the more recent past. So I encourage you to find those books and to read up on it. So setting the stage, we go back about 15,000 years. Where I'm sitting now, I'm under hundreds and hundreds of meters of ice. Continental glacier covers all of Canada. The glacier extends as far as New York City, but it starts to melt about 15,000 years ago. It eventually will be replaced by an inland sea, and the inland sea is because the earth had been depressed by the weight of the glaciers. So 12,000 years ago, the land was much, much lower than it is today, and so the sea came in and flooded a lot of the Ottawa Valley. In fact, if you were at the Ottawa airport 12,000 years ago, you'd have beluga whales and seals. If you went up to White Lake near Arnprior, there would be bowhead whales, the largest mammal on Earth. The remains were found there. So it's a very different environment. It's a very dynamic environment because by 10,500 years ago, the sea has started to recede significantly. And instead, Hudson's Bay is still frozen over, and all the water that normally flows north is flowing through the Ottawa Valley. So the levels of the Ottawa River are nothing at all resembling what you see today. In fact, up until about 4,700 years ago, Lakes Superior, Michigan, and Huron are all draining through the Mattawa and into the Ottawa River. So up until that point, you wouldn't recognize the Ottawa Valley. For example, were the Chaudière Falls there, or were they just rapids, or were they just underneath that mass of water that's flowing? We don't know. But the land has changed a lot. So what is the earliest evidence that we can find in the Ottawa area for people being here? Archaeologically, there was a point, an object found by a farmer who was plowing a field in South Ottawa, Mr. Charles Cutt. And in 1917, he was walking behind his horse and he found an object that was kept in the family up until 1997, when one of his grandchildren brought it to the museum and showed it to me. It turns out to be a point that is very distinctive in its shape, the way it was flaked, the way it was manufactured, very deep, narrow notches in a rounded base. And it's identical to points that we find in the Midwestern United States that date to about 9,000, 9,500 years ago. There's very few known in Ontario. There's a handful perhaps in southern Ontario. There's one that was found fairly recently up near Maynooth, south of Algonquin Park. But that's about the earliest evidence that we have. Then if you go across the Ottawa River, right behind me virtually, to Point Gatineau, there's a park now, it's called Point Albinan. And in 2014, Hydro-Quebec was doing some work in that park, and they started to find archaeological remains. There was an excavation there. And the archaeologists found that that particular spot, people had come back to year after year after year, spanning several thousand years. And the earliest occupation that we can tell, based on radiocarbon dating, goes back about 7,000 years. And interesting about those, the people who were staying there, they had pretty good relationships with people to the south. They were trading for different kinds of stone to make their tools that are very characteristic of sources that we know of to the south, rather than to the north or the east or the west. So that's 7,000 years ago. Now, if you continue on the Quebec side of the river into Limy Lake Park, as most of you have heard, there is a very important archaeological complex there. There's at least 16 known archaeological sites. All of them have been occupied time and time again over centuries, building up like a layer cake. And in each one of those layers you will find distinctive kinds of artifacts. And they again speak about extensive trade networks literally spanning the continent. We find stone that comes from the center of Quebec, stone that comes from the tip of Labrador, stone that comes from Hudson's Bay, stone that comes from the western end of Lake Ontario. And so these are very extensive networks that archaeology can demonstrate with very tangible proof. And interestingly, in 1899, Gertrude Kenny wrote an article where she talked about exactly that kind of trade fair. People coming from all over North America, meeting here at the confluence of the Rideau, the Gatineau, and the Ottawa, and exchanging. And she talks about all of the things that were exchanged, agricultural products, furs, bark for making canoes, and canoes themselves. And there are probably people who decided to stay on as well, and ideas and new ways of doing things and of making things. And she published this in 1899 in the Transactions of the Women's Canadian Historical Society of Ottawa, the forerunner of the Historical Society of Ottawa. It's part of the group that helped to create the Bytown Museum. So it's fantastic that she would do this and sort of point us in the direction. It's too bad it took us nearly a century to figure it out, but that's okay. Now we have to turn the clock forward a little bit. Marcel Laliberté was an archaeologist who happened to be on holidays in the area, and he rented a bike and went down to the shores of the Ottawa River in Limy Lake Park and started to find artifacts. And that was the beginning of a 30-year program of investigation into the ancient history in that area. And what we've found since is that Limy Lake Park has some sites that go back as much as 4,000 to 5,000 years or more. Again, echoing what was found at Point Albinan. And so the importance of this region was really, really highlighted with the work that is still ongoing. As you know, the National Capital Commission has field schools there every summer. So maybe now I'll get off the river a little bit and look at some of the other things that have been found in the general Ottawa area. That will give you an idea, because I wouldn't want you to think that people are only traveling along the Ottawa River and they're ignoring that this is just a place of passage. It is a place where people lived and stayed. So we can go, for example, to Mooney's Bay. And in the 1950s, there was an object found at Mooney's Bay that looks like a woodworking tool, and probably was a woodworking tool, but it was manufactured out of native copper. Now, native copper is found in a relatively pure form, and it can be worked by cold hammering it. But eventually, by cold hammering it, the material, the metal, the copper gets brittle and starts to crack. And surprisingly, about 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, people figured out that if you heat the copper in a fire to a certain temperature, and I couldn't tell you what that is, it will change the molecular structure of the copper so that you can continue pounding it and getting it much thinner and folding it and shaping it. And that's a technology that is very ancient. And by the way, the copper comes from the western end of Lake Superior, but it made it to Mooney's Bay, and it was found there in the 1950s. Another important piece of the puzzle when we talk about these long-distance trade networks are the routes that people would take to get to the confluence of the Gatineau River. Now, for example, we're sitting here today in Rockcliffe Park, and there are a number of sites that were found in Rockcliffe Park, about 20 years ago, that suggest that they are part of a portage that would lead from the Rideau down to the Ottawa and vice versa. So a portage is absolutely critical for people to get around the falls, the Rideau Falls. And so we know that they probably cut through the Governor General's residence. Of course, couldn't do that today, but nonetheless, we have fairly good evidence to suggest that that's one of the routes that they were taken. And so that's an important site as well. Another really critical site to understand the region's ancient history is found right in front of the Museum of History, the Canadian Museum of History. There used to be a burial place there. There might still be elements of those burials, or some of those burials. And it's an interesting location because it was located at the foot of a portage. So when you were coming up the Ottawa River and you had to go around the Chaudière Falls, there was a natural embayment there where the water was still. It was a perfect place with sandy beaches, perfect place to get out of your canoe, perhaps stay there for a few days, meet some people who were traveling along, and then make your portage up and around the Chaudière Falls. But the burial place was located in such a way that it was close to the camping area. It was close to the portage route. And it suggests that people understood the importance of being able to communicate with the people who had been buried there, with the people who had passed on. And so it's an interesting place to give us an indication of how people envisage that relationship between the living and the dead. At least that's my interpretation of it. And so even today, Anishinaabe Algonquin people consider that to be a very, very important and a very, very special place. And as far as we can tell from the little bit of information that survived about how the remains, human remains, were found there, it is suggested that the burial place was used over 4,000 to 5,000 years. So a very long span of time. People would not only come into the area to trade, to meet friends and relatives, to determine what they were going to do in the winter, to share ideas, but it was also a place where they would come to leave their loved ones, and a place where they knew that they could encounter those loved ones once again. If we go to Carleton University, for example, and you just look across the Rideau River from Carleton University, there's a site there, right at the foot of the portage, that we know people have been using for at least 4,000 to 5,000 years. It's a small, probably a rest camp when people were moving through, but again, there's all of the evidence of materials that come from distant locations. There's another site that is found in East Ottawa that's one of my favorites. It's an object that's in the collections of the Canadian Museum of History, and it's a woodworking tool, a gouge of some kind. And it has a label on it that is handwritten. The label itself is an artifact because it's well over a century old. And it's written on it, found in Graham's Brickyard, Ottawa East, 20 feet below the surface, December 1892. Stop and contemplate for a minute. You're in a brickyard, so there's probably clay. You're digging 20 feet down in December? For one thing, that would have been an interesting event, but what is an artifact like that doing buried at that kind of depth? Don't know, but it's a beautiful artifact, beautiful ground stone woodworking gouge. If you walk along Wellington Street, just west of Bank, you will find, or at least it was found in about 1916, this bowl of a stone pipe, just about in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. It's one of the very few artifacts, pre-contact artifacts, that was found in downtown Ottawa, because if you look at downtown Ottawa, you've seen all sorts of destruction taking place with the building of all those towers and the more recent construction. Yet this is an important object because it represents or suggests some kind of ritual activity. The consumption of tobacco was not just a habit, but it was very much linked to satisfying certain ritual needs. And interestingly, recently on Parliament Hill, there were excavations in preparation for the new interpretive center there. And when they were digging in proximity to one of the British garrison's buildings, they found a stone knife, a stone tool that has been interpreted as a knife. It's a very symbolically charged and important piece right on Parliament Hill. But it is not the only pre-contact object that has been found on Parliament Hill. There were a few years ago some red ochre nodules. Red ochre is used in ritual preparations or decoration. There was a disc bead, a shell bead that was found in proximity as well, and I think a potsherd or two. So enough to suggest that there are activities taking place even up there on Parliament Hill in ancient times. We don't know very much about what the sites might have been because, again, there's been so much destruction by the British garrison and then all sorts of iterations of the Parliament buildings, but it is a place that was used. And we can only imagine that a lot of downtown Ottawa saw similar kinds of sporadic, random uses. I'll end with just perhaps a suggestion that we can look at landscapes like downtown Ottawa and we can see a lot of metal and we can see a lot of glass. But what we really should be doing is trying to look at these landscapes and seeing the resources that once were there. Samuel de Champlain, when he went through here in June of 1613, and he stopped, or at least he described the Rideau Falls, did not call them Rideau Falls, but he was describing the area as one that was rich in resources. Rich in resources such that the local or the people, and he was referring to the indigenous people, liked to come here and stop for a while because they could get a good living while they were here and it was a pleasant surroundings. So it's a real challenge, but try the next time you walk down, I don't know, Elgid Street or walk along Wellington. Try to imagine a forest there. Try to imagine deer or other game going through, and try to imagine how people might have seen, for example, standing on what is today Parliament Hill. How could they have seen that landscape with certainly eyes that are different from ours today?